Screw that table on there. There we go. We'll just leave that ring there. I was just going to stay there, Alex. So, yeah. So I know when we moved here from our small town in North Carolina, our choices of eating out, of going on a date to a restaurant, were all fast food. You could go to this fast food restaurant or that fast food. Our little town had every fast food restaurant you could ever imagine. So Rebecca and I are going on a date. Is it going to be McDonald's, Wendy's, or Burger King, this Friday? And that was it. And every fast food place you can imagine, they just kept coming. I'm just like, where's the good restaurants in our little town? And I come to Bakersfield. We moved here a year ago, and man, there are choices in the big city. We call this the big city. I don't know if you call it the big city. For us, it's like endless choices, so much variety. We can go everywhere, and we're loving it. We love to go out to eat. We love to go on dates on at least a weekly basis, and so we're loving it. We're loving all the choices, but it's tough to decide. We're still looking for the right pizza place. All right, so we haven't found the one yet. We had the one back in North Carolina. So if you have any recommendations, write it on the comment card in your pews. Put it in the Welcome Center basket there. That'd be great. We need some pizza recommendations. But there's so many choices. What are we going to choose? And I'm going to date myself on this next illustration. But we have a lot of choices on what to watch on TV, don't we? There's a lot of choices. In fact, those of you who are old enough, I won't call you out, but I'm old enough to know that back in the day, we had 3 channels, all right? I'm that old. And we had rabbit ear antennas, and we had to go and adjust them and turn the channel on a knob on the TV. And even when you turned on the TV, you had to wait for it to warm up. Right? I mean, it was crazy. It was crazy. But then came cable, right? Cable TV. And Bruce Springsteen wrote a song about it in 1992. He said there's 57 channels and nothing on. Someone knows the reference there. Bruce Springsteen, 1992. There's 57 channels and nothing on. You got a lot of choices with cable TV. Of course, my parents never would pay for cable TV, right? I had to get, when I moved out of the house, that's when I got cable TV. And but there's still so many choices, you never know what to do. And then streaming came, right? And that was a breakthrough. And what was the first streaming platform? Netflix, right? I think it was Netflix, unless someone's got a little angle on a different idea there. But Netflix, one streaming channel, but it was revolutionary because you could choose what to watch when you wanted to watch it. Cable TV, for all you kids here, cable TV, you can't choose. It just is on, it just goes, and you have to jump in wherever the program, I missed the first half of the program, right? Maybe it'll come on next week. Netflix was huge, right? That was a huge revolution in choices. By 2022, there were all kinds of different streaming platforms. In fact, I'm going to confess something to you guys. I don't even know how many streaming platforms we subscribe to. I've lost track. I really have, and that's sad. Dave Ramsey would say, shame on you, Chris, for losing track on all your subscriptions. But I don't even know how many we have. We got a whole bunch. We got almost all of them, right? And there's so many things on. By 2022, there were over 800,000 individual unique programs to choose from on TV that you had to choose from. And now, 2026, 4 years later, I asked AI. AI didn't even know, right? There's so many, AI doesn't even know. It said there's millions and millions of unique programs to choose from if you subscribe to the American streaming platforms, all right? So there's a lot of choices. Now, have you ever scrolled all through the channels? Have you ever been channel surfing and just given up, saying, I don't know what to watch? Anybody? Yeah, right. We've all been there, right? So many choices, we don't know where to turn. Well, today we're going to continue on in the book of Mark, and we're going to look at 2 choices that people made. Peter made one choice, and a crowd of people made another choice, but they made the choice in the wrong direction. They made the wrong choice. See, I believe that we have a choice to live life to the fullest. John 10:10, Jesus says, I have come that you may have life and have it to the what? Have it to the full. Or the King James says, have it more abundantly. But I think it's a choice. I think we have to choose to accept Jesus' offer. I think, just like the song said, his arms are open wide. He's saying, come on over. But we've got to make that choice. And so many people choose the wrong direction because there are so many choices of what we need to do and what we get to do in our lives. There's a ton of wrong choices, and there's some right choices. So today we're going to look at the choices that were made in the wrong direction as we continue this Easter story in the book of Mark, and we're going to be in chapter 14, and we're going to learn from their mistakes, and Peter learned from his mistake eventually. We're going to learn from the wrong choices how we can find a principle to choose the right choices. Because the principles of why they chose the wrong way, we can learn from those principles and have an everlasting principle to make the right choices in the right direction. So we're going to be in Mark chapter 14. And last week, we've been following this journey of Jesus. He starts up in Galilee in the north, and he heads towards Jerusalem, and he's got his eyes set on Jerusalem because that's where he knows he's going to die on the cross, and he's going to fulfill his mission, and he's going to be raised from the dead. And as he travels, he's telling everybody, I'm going to go to Jerusalem. I'm going to die. I'm going to rise again. And they're not getting it. It's going over their heads. They're just like, this isn't making sense. This is not the Jesus I want. I want the Jesus that's going to go to Jerusalem and kick out the Romans and fight those Romans and take over politically. But Jesus had his eyes set on Jerusalem, and he knew the suffering that would come. And last week we talked about how he was anointed in Bethany, a little suburb of Jerusalem, by Mary, and he was anointed because he was going to be king, and he was anointed because he was getting ready, he would say, for burial, and you're anointing my body for burial, because Jesus knows what's coming. And today, if you look in chapter 14, we're going to skip the Last Supper and go to what comes next, and we're going to circle back to the Last Supper on Good Friday, all right? So we'll come back to that. We're going to jump to verse 27. And verse 27, picture the setting at first, all right? So the setting is Jesus is anointed at Bethany. They go into Jerusalem. It's the feast of the Passover. Jesus takes the Passover feast and completely changes the meaning of their most sacred ritual in the Jewish custom, and he changes the meaning for that Passover feast to be communion, to be the Last Supper. And he says, you've done it like this in the past as the Passover, but now this is my blood that's going to be shed. This is my body that's going to be broken. And they're just like, wow, I don't even know what's going on. Jesus is messing with our most sacred ritual, and he's completely changing the meaning. What is going on? Judas, in the meantime, he takes off, right? He goes on his covert mission to betray Jesus. And the 11 disciples and Jesus, after supper, they go up to the Mount of Olives, which is just right by Jerusalem. It's just overlooking the city. So they go on a little after-dinner hike up the mountain. And from the Mountain of Olives, they can see Jerusalem below them. And they can see the temple right in front of them, right? They're right above the temple looking down. And it's on the Mount of Olives that the Garden of Gethsemane is up there as well. It's on the west side. So they're going up to this mountain, and Jesus knows in the next 24 hours, they'll know exactly what I've been predicting all through this journey, because this is going to happen right now. It's going to happen quick. So Jesus, again, he shoots straight with them. He says this, verse 27. They're up there on the mountain. They're looking over Jerusalem. They see the temple. And Jesus says, you will all fall away. You will all fall away, Jesus told them. For it is written, and he quotes Zechariah 13, verse 7. He says, it is written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will scatter. We think about how Peter denied Jesus, but they all denied Jesus, right? They all turned their back on Jesus. And Jesus says it's going to happen. You're going to all turn your back. But, he says, verse 28, after I've risen, I will go ahead of you to Galilee. And the disciples, they're not getting it, right? We're not going to fall away. We're here, Jesus. We're on your side. And we don't know all the things you keep talking about suffering and death, and we don't understand that. But Jesus says, I'm going to meet you back in Galilee, to which they probably thought, oh, that's good, because Galilee's their hometown. Galilee's back home. That's where they came from on this big, long journey. And they said, oh, we can hardly wait to be back to Galilee because this Jerusalem thing is stressful, right? I mean, there's tension, there's crowds. All the Pharisees and religious leaders are up in arms against Jesus. And they're probably thinking, oh, please let us get back to the hometown. Let us go back to Galilee. And sure enough, Jesus predicts what would happen. When Jesus rose from the dead, he went to Jerusalem first and met them in the room, but then second, he met them on the Sea of Galilee. And when he met them on the Sea of Galilee, Jesus would forgive Peter and recommission his disciples. He's telling them, you're all going to fall away, but in Galilee, in a little while, you're all going to be recommissioned. I'm going to restart this group, and you're going to be invigorated, and it's going to be exactly according to plan. But Peter declared, even if all those guys fall away, and Peter was the brash one, he was the bold one, he was the outspoken one, right? Peter said, even if all of these other guys fall away, I'm not falling away, right? To which the other disciples were probably rolling their eyes, right? There's Peter again. Ever since Jesus called him the rock, he thinks he's all that, he's looking down at us. But Peter says, I'm not going to fall away, even if they do. And Jesus says directly to him, the bold guy, Jesus says, truly I tell you, Jesus answered, today, yes, tonight, before the rooster crows twice, you yourself, Peter, will disown me 3 times. And Jesus calls it out, very specific, very precise. But Peter insisted emphatically, even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you. And all the others chimed in, yeah, like he said, we're not going to die, Jesus. We would die for you, Jesus. We're never going to disown you. And part of that is true, right? They said, we would die for you, Jesus. And after their denial and after they are recommissioned, they would die for Jesus. After they get the Holy Spirit, they did die for Jesus, right? So part of that is true, just not yet. First, before that happens, they make a decision to choose the wrong direction. But Jesus is a forgiving God. So, we'd all die for you, Jesus. Jumping over to verse 66, all right? We're going to skip the part where Jesus is arrested. He goes through a trial. He's arrested and he's thrown into jail. And here comes what Jesus said was coming when Peter would deny Jesus. He made the wrong choice. 14 verse 66, while Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. So Jesus is arrested. He's in chains. He's being beaten. All right, it's the middle of the night. They had supper. They went up on the Mount of Olives. They went to the Garden of Gethsemane, got arrested, back in Jerusalem. The disciples are scattered everywhere, but Peter's hanging around by the fire, trying to keep warm, not knowing what to do. And a servant girl, a teenage girl, right? She's a girl, she's a teenager, she's young, and she's a servant. This is a person with zero power. Right? This is a person, you couldn't pick a lower power person to confront Peter. I mean, this girl has no authority, right? She's a servant girl. And Peter folds like a deck of cards, right? Peter, the fisherman, right? Peter is the epitome of the alpha male, right? He is bold, brash, a fisherman. Jesus just called him the rock, right? Peter, the most low authority person that could ever confronts him, and he just folds, right? He denies Jesus. Verse 67, when she saw Peter warming himself, she looked closely at him. You also were with that Nazarene Jesus, she said. And Peter, he denied it. I don't understand what you're talking about. He claimed ignorance. I don't know what you're talking about, right? He said, and he went out into the entryway. Basically, he ran away from the girl, right? He runs away from a teenage servant girl, Peter, right? The alpha male, all right? Verse 69, when the servant girl saw him over there, she said again, look at that guy over there. Hey, guys, look at that guy over there. This fellow is one of them, one of those disciples. But again, Peter denied it. What was Peter doing? Peter was choosing fear over faith. And it happened so quick, right? It happened so fast that he didn't even really know what he was doing, but he made the choice. He chose fear over faith. He chose self-preservation over sacrifice. Just when they had said, we'll all die for you, Jesus, Peter chose self-preservation, right? When people are backed into a corner, they'll throw anybody under the bus, right? If they don't have faith, if they don't have courage. Peter chose fear. 2 times. After a little while, those standing near to Peter said, surely you are the one, for you are a Galilean. And he began to call down curses and swore to them. Peter swore like a sailor, because he was a sailor, right? That he was actually a sailor, so he was just using his natural language, swearing and swearing to people. I don't know this man that you're talking about, and I don't know what swearing in that language is or in that culture is. But he was swearing like a fisherman. What was he doing? He was going back to his old ways. His old ways, his old language, when he was a fisherman, before he met Jesus. And he's saying self-preservation. I don't know this man you're talking about. This was the most direct denial of Jesus of the 3. And then immediately the rooster crowed a second time. Then Peter remembered the word of Jesus had spoken to him. Before the rooster crows twice, he will disown me 3 times. And he broke down and wept. Peter chose fear over faith. That's a decision that we don't want to make. We don't want to choose fear, right? We want to choose courage. We want to choose Jesus. We want to choose faith. So let's learn from that. One more choice, though. We're going to keep going into the next situation, verse 15. So just keep going right next to chapter 15, verse 1. And here's the other choice that gets made in the wrong direction. Since then, Peter is probably still weeping. He's probably still weeping in the courtyard. And it says, very early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders, the teachers of the law, the whole Sanhedrin made their plans. So they bound Jesus and led him away and handed him over to Pilate. It's early in the morning. It's still all in that same story. Peter's probably out somewhere crying, just admitting, I just blew it big time. And Jesus is getting ready to march before Pilate. And they've got everybody, every religious leader. I mean, look at the list. I mean, they've got a coalition against Jesus. And they think if we can just bring him to Pilate, the crowds aren't going to be mad at us, because that was one of their concerns, the crowds. The second concern is we can't execute someone as Jews, but Pilate can. We just have to convince him. So that's what they do. That's what they have in mind. Verse 2, Pilate asked Jesus, are you the king of the Jews? Asked Pilate. Pilate's first task was to see, is this guy an insurrectionist? Is this guy going to try to take us over politically? Because if he admits to being king, that's a political decision. And then that's serious, right? Because then that's overthrow, that's a threat to Rome. So Jesus doesn't say yes or no. He says, you have said so, right? He doesn't say yes. He doesn't say no. He is the king of the Jews, and so much more. Verse 3, the chief priests accused him of many things. So again, Pilate asked him, aren't you going to answer? See how many things they're accusing you of. In the different Gospels, you have different highlights into this different story. So Luke actually lists the things that the chief priests are accusing him of. All kinds of things. Tax evasion, blasphemy, insurrection, all kinds of different conspiracies, all kinds of things that he is accused of, but Jesus remained silent. Still, Jesus made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. This is life or death, and Jesus is saying nothing. But we know that Jesus is fulfilling the Old Testament prophecy. Isaiah 53:7 says this. It says, he was oppressed and afflicted. And this is the prophecy of the coming Messiah. Way back a long time ago, he was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter. Like a lamb. right? What did they use lambs for back in the Old Testament? They would take the spotless lamb and offer it up as a sacrifice for the sins of the people. And it's showing Jesus is fulfilling those those prophecies. Like a lamb to the slaughter, and as sheep before its shearers is silent. So he did not open his mouth. And Jesus knows this. This is the time. All these Old Testament prophecies are being fulfilled. Verse 6. Now it was the custom at the festival to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. And the crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. Now Barabbas was no regular prisoner. Barabbas was a terrorist according to Rome, but according to the Israelites, according to the Jews, he was a freedom fighter, right? He was a zealot. One of Jesus' disciples, Simon, the other Simon, was also a zealot. And a zealot, their job was to violently overthrow Rome. That was their goal. We're going to do whatever it takes to gain political, earthly power. And so when the crowd is given the choice, Barabbas or Jesus, what they're given a choice is, what do you want? Earthly power or spiritual power? You know, Barabbas is just not a random criminal. They're making a choice to choose the leader that they want. And they didn't like Jesus' leadership style. Jesus wanted to forgive people. He said you should be serving people. He said turn the other cheek. He said love your enemy. And they liked Barabbas' message. Kill your enemy, right? Violently. And that's what Barabbas had done. He was a murderer. Two different styles of leadership right there. Verse 9 says, Pilate says, do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews? Pilate's probably thinking, this guy's amazing. He's your most famous rabbi. This guy's miraculously healing people. So if you want me to release Jesus, king of the Jews, Pilate's like, I'm more than willing to do that. But he was knowing that the chief priests, it was out of self-interest that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him. He knew Jesus was innocent. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. Sinful Barabbas, murderer Barabbas, is released, while sinless Jesus, the Prince of Peace, is condemned, right? Interesting, the name Barabbas consists of two words, Bar Abbas, and Abba means father, and Bar is the son of. And you see that in the Bible, Bar means son, and Abba means father. So Barabbas' name means son of the Father. Jesus was the Son of God the Father. And yet in this twist here, the people choose to let go the sinful Son of the Father, Barabbas, and choose to condemn the true Son of the living God, who's Jesus. And that's all in this text. They choose Barabbas. They make a terrible choice, but it's all in Jesus' plan. Verse 12 says, what shall I do? Then with the one you call King of the Jews, Pilate asks them, and they choose violence. They say, crucify him, they shouted. Why, said Pilate, what crime has he committed? But they shouted all the louder, crucify him. They chose violence over peace, and wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them and had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. In the version that Matthew gives, he gives extra detail, and he says that Pilate looked at this whole situation and he washed his hands of the whole situation and said, that blood's not on my hands. You guys choose that. You made that choice to kill Jesus. I have nothing to do with it. That's your choice. So we have choices to make. Jesus chose to go to the cross. The crowd chose Barabbas instead of Jesus. In going to the cross, Jesus fulfilled so many Old Testament things, but he even fulfilled his first sermon. In his first sermon Jesus gave in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus gives the Beatitudes. We've been studying that on Wednesday night here at our Bible study. And Jesus said, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. That's how Jesus went to the cross, right? He didn't open his mouth. He knew that that was his task. He chose the cross even though he didn't have to. He chose the cross. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Jesus said in his first sermon, blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Peter chose fear over faith. This crowd, they chose violence over peace. They chose earthly power over spiritual power. They chose man over God. They chose all these things instead of making the right choice, and the right choice was choosing Jesus. That was the right choice. They chose violence. They chose earthly power. They chose a man. They made the wrong choice, right? But God had it all under control. We still face big choices of what we want to do with Jesus. In fact, I would say, you guys, that's our biggest choice. Our biggest choice in life is, what will we do with Jesus? That was Peter's big choice. What will I do with Jesus? He turned away. He walked away. He was too scared, right? He was afraid. He turned his back on Jesus. The crowd had a choice. What do you do with Jesus? They shouted him down. They shouted against him. They rebelled against his style of leadership. The question for us is, what will we do with Jesus? The biggest question that we're ever going to be asked. Will we deny him? Will we turn our back on him? Maybe we'll just ignore him. Maybe we'll shout out against him. Or will we choose to follow him? Right? That's what he invites us to. Follow me. And we have to make a choice. Now, you can look at Peter and just, well, he was tired, he was stressed out, he was doing self-preservation. Hey, in our lives, we're going to have all kinds of scenarios in which we make all kinds of choices. The question is, are we standing on Jesus when we make great choices, or when we choose things? And I want to learn a little bit about this and how Peter chose and how the crowd chose, to give some principles on how we need to make good choices. Life is about choices. If we want to live life to the fullest, we have to make the right choices in that direction. So, picture Peter in a situation. He's scared, he's confused, he's tired, he's pressured into a quick decision. When you have choices to make in your life, Heritage Church, what's your scenario? What's your mindset at the time of making choices? I want to give us just some practical tips on how Peter made the wrong choice, and some practical tips on how we can make the right choices. And some practical tips are, maybe don't make a decision when you're tired or angry or scared or pressured into it, right? We can make all kinds of wrong choices when we're not in the right mindset. So think about this when people make wrong choices. I was on social media this week, and there was a prime example of someone who made a wrong choice to post something while they were mad. All right? Here's a principle. If you're mad, don't post anything. All right? If you're mad, don't make the email. Don't send an email being mad. Take a minute. Right? Calm down. Put things in perspective. And I watched this angry Facebook post spiral out of control. Right? You've seen those happen if you've ever been on Facebook. It starts with something and it just gets worse and worse and worse. And pretty soon, and these are people I know, pretty soon they're fighting and mad at each other. And eventually the guy who made the original quote, he said, whoa, hold on. This is too much. This is not what I intended to go down this rabbit hole of anger, right? Don't make decisions when you're angry. Take a minute to relax. I had a good friend of mine who, whenever there was an important decision, he just said, let me sleep on it. Let me sleep on it. Let me get well rested. Let me let it sink in. Let me take a little bit of time and make a wise decision on this. Don't make a decision when you're angry. Don't make a decision when you're tired. Have you ever been in the situation where you took a big step of faith and you made a big decision, but then you wake up at 2:30 in the morning and you're just like, oh, why did I make that decision? Boy, this is going to be terrible. And have you ever had that happen? I don't know. It happens to me all the time, you guys. I don't know if it happens to you guys, but I'll wake up at 2:30 in the morning and just like, I shouldn't have made that decision. You guys, don't make big decisions at 2:30 in the morning. All right? Just don't do it. You're in no headspace to make a good decision when you're tired. If at all possible, make your decisions when you're not angry, when you're rested, when you have time to think and pursue some wisdom when it comes to your decision, right? Make those decisions. Make big decisions when you're on your A game, when you're confident, right? When you're rested, when you have energy, when you have perspective, right? When you're in a good headspace. That's when we want to make the big decisions in life. Now, I know sometimes you got to make a decision on the fly, right? And then you just got to pray, God, I'm praying that I'm making this decision with courage, with wisdom, with the right moral foundation, placing my morals on the foundation of Jesus. You know, sometimes you got to make it on the fly, but if possible, wait for yourself to be on your A game and then make those big decisions. And then, like a good mentor friend of mine would always say, what you've decided in the light, don't doubt in the darkness, right? When you're on your A game and you make a decision and it's a big decision to go forward, a big step of faith, when you make that decision in the light on your A game, when it's 2:30 in the morning or when you have doubts or when something didn't go right, don't doubt what God called you to in the light when you feel like you're in the darkness. Trust it. I do this all the time. Sometimes I think like, especially when it gets up to 100 degrees like yesterday, I'm just like, why Bakersfield? It's so hot, right? Get into my car and I can't touch the steering wheel and it's just like, why, God? But no, what God has called me to in the light, I'm not going to doubt when things are too hot. Right? So I do that all the time. I did this in every ministry I've ever been in. When I go through tough times in ministry, I remember how God called me there. Because God called me there when I was on my A game, when I prayed through it, when I made a wise decision, when I took a big step of faith, and then lo and behold, it doesn't always go right. That's life, right? I trust what God has called me to in the light. And I trust that. Now, even if we're always rested, always not mad, we're in a good mood, even if everything goes right, hey, sometimes we make a bad call, right? Sometimes that happens, right? And that we're just people. Sometimes we make a bad call. But for the most part, we can make the right decisions if we have the right information and we're in the right mindset. Most of the time, we can make the right decisions. We're fallible. We'll make the wrong one sometimes, and that's okay. We can own it and say, hey, I tried my best. Let God do the rest, right? We can do that. But I learned from Peter, just like all the things he was in his situation. He made the wrong call. I want to make sure that I'm in the right headspace to make the right calls. Now, what about the crowd? The crowd chose violence over peace. I would encourage you to choose peace over violence, right? Choose love instead of anger, right? I mean, we can make those decisions to choose love, to choose peace, to choose unity, right? It doesn't always work out, but we want to lean in that direction, the direction of Jesus who said, I love every single one of you, right? Because you're all created in God's image. So choose peace over violence. And if you have ever someone coming to you to say, like, you need to rise up against your enemies. You need to hate the person who doesn't agree with you. Be careful with that, right? That is the number one way to get votes, right, in our democracy, right? The number one way to get votes is make people mad against the bad guys. Make them scared of the people who believe something different. Make them scared. And I'm telling you what, scared people can be manipulated, right? Angry people can be manipulated, right? If someone is trying to get you violent and mad and angry and scared, just be on your guard. Be on your guard. See through that tactic and pray for God's wisdom in there. Now, we live in a democracy, which the Bible people didn't have, right? So we can vote our values, and I totally am all on board on that. I've never missed an election when I've had the opportunity, right? I'm a believer in the responsibility of our democracy. We should be voting our values. But you know what makes more of a difference in the world than voting your values? Living your values, right? If we want to make a real difference in our world, the earthly power is not going to make that much of a difference. We've seen that, right? Earthly power, relying on politics to save us. Man, that's a fool's errand, right? Democracy is important, but what will make the biggest impact in your life, your sphere, in your community? Live your values. Choose that as well, right? Choose that. Voting your values is an aside. That's great. We'll do that on the side. But I'm going to live my values for my family, for my community, for my church. And that's going to make it, because that's spiritual power. We're not relying on earthly power like that crowd did. They wanted their earthly power. It didn't work out well for them, right? But the people that chose Jesus and that spiritual power, hey, 2,000 years ago, we're in the church that was founded by Jesus. It's still going on, right? The earthly power comes and goes. Spiritual power remains firm, even though we're challenged in the process. So choose spiritual power over earthly power. And choose Jesus over man, right? The crowd chose Barabbas over Jesus. We need to choose Jesus over all else. My values in my life are God, family, then church. Those are my values, right? I'm choosing God first because that's the foundation that I build my family and my church, right? But God comes first. I'm choosing Him first. I'm choosing God over man every time. At least I strive to when I'm on my A game. So choose that. And we've been talking a lot about choices, right? And as we wrap up, I want to do a theological timeout. Okay? So sometimes I do these theological timeouts where I say, hey, let's talk about something a little complicated when it comes to choices. And our worship team is going to get ready to close. But here's a theological timeout. There's this thing in theology about Calvinism versus Arminianism. All right, now it's going to get deep. All right, now it's going to get complicated. It's about free will versus predestination. Right? That's some deep theological waters. But to give it in a nutshell, free will is about us choosing God. And predestination is about God choosing us, right? So Calvinism is about God choosing us. Arminianism is about us choosing God. Aren't both those things in the Bible? They are both together, right? So some people would make this a black and white issue. Either your free will or your predestination. Either you make all the choices or you make none of the choices. And I don't think it's a black and white issue. I think it's a complicated theological issue that we maybe don't have the language to fully comprehend the mind of God when it comes to the fact that God knows what you're going to choose. That's so complicated, right? Do we really have a choice if God knows we're going to choose or deny Him? God knows. He knows what you're going to pick. To me, that's terrifying, right? And that was terrifying to me when I was deciding whether I wanted to be. God already knows. What if He knows I'm not going to choose Him? That's terrible. Well, I better choose Him because I'm not going to be in that camp, right? So I think, you guys, sometimes we get a little too divided on this free will and predestination thing because God is sovereign and He does 100% of the saving. We do not save ourselves. And yet still we can choose to accept Him or reject Him. And God will hold us responsible for our choice, even though He knows what we're going to choose. All right? So that's my theological timeout. I think that we can come to a good spot in the middle. I have many friends who are Presbyterians, who are in Calvinists, who believe in predestination, and I believe in choice, right? Most of the time we're talking the same language with different words, right? We can come together on the Jesus part and be united about that all day long. But I really believe that we have to choose to live life to the fullest. It's a choice we have to make. And if we choose Jesus, that'll be a step in that direction. And we all want to live the most abundant, fulfilling, incredible life possible, even in the tough times, especially in the tough times. That abundant life is going to hold us when those trials come, because they'll come. So, as we get ready to close, I want to read one more scripture, and it's not on the screen. It's Romans 10, verse 9. And it says this. Romans 10, verse 9 is the simplest salvation verse that we have in the Bible. There's salvation verses all throughout the New Testament. There's all kinds. I always write down, that's a salvation verse. I write it in my Bible. Salvation verse, salvation verse, salvation verse. But Romans 10 verse 9 is the simplest one. If you declare with your mouth, Jesus is Lord, and you believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. I want us to think about that. Let's stand to our feet as we get ready to worship. If you declare with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, and you believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. And I want us now to do something a little, make a choice. It's a little uncomfortable. I'm going to ask you to say something out loud right now. Are you good with that? Okay, good. So you're warmed up already. Right now, if you believe it, I want you to say, Jesus is Lord. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Jesus is Lord, right? You don't have to say it. You can mouth it if you want without saying it if you don't believe it. But because it's a choice we have to make. So on the count of 3, Jesus is Lord. 1, 2, 3. Jesus is Lord. Man, Romans 10 verse 9, if you confess, if you say that with your mouth and believe it in your heart that God raised him from the dead. And when we say Jesus is Lord, that's a capital L. That means he's Lord of my life. He's the boss of my life. My life revolves around him. Let's say it one more time. 1, 2, 3. Jesus is Lord. That's a choice in the right direction. Let's pray. God, thank you so much for this morning, and thank you that we can learn from Peter and this crowd, and we can learn from the many sinful people